Well, believe it or not, we're halfway through our course, and we're still deep in some chapters here in the Grotius book that are of a challenge. You recall the last week I shortened our reading, and I did that primarily because we had both reading and a quiz due the same week, and I figured that might be more challenging to move, or less challenging to move a couple of chapters into this week. So hopefully you have downloaded the new syllabus and you kind of know where we're headed. And in this lecture, we're going to talk about chapters 13 and 14 of the Grotius book. And so we're going to get into some fields related to science. We started on that with cosmology last time around, but we're going to get into more detail looking at origins, design, and Darwinism, and then the intelligent design theory in the next chapter. So again, we're going to try to keep these lectures as short as possible. I just want to point out to you what you need to know as the high points of each of these chapters. Remember, there will be a form question this week, and there'll be outlines, all those kinds of things. But we don't have a quiz coming up this week, so that's helpful. Now, he gets into the discussion here of Darwinism, and I found this to be a fascinating study for a number of reasons. For one thing, just his thorough knowledge of the Darwinian issues. That's not really Grotius's primary forte. He spends more time writing stuff on pure apologetics, philosophy of religion, truth. In his early career, he wrote a couple of books on the New Age movement, which was fairly new back there, 25 or so years ago when he was writing those books. But he knows a lot about science as well, enough at least to give us some really good outlines and suggestions about where we can go to follow up on what we're reading here. Starts out on page 266 by saying the majority of Americans believe in God, and a smaller percentage holds to a fully naturalistic Darwinian account of life. Again, I'm not going to try to cover page by page. We simply don't have time. But let me make one distinction here that you may or may not have run across before, and that is important to understanding Grotius's book and any other works that would deal in this subject. So Bill Dembski's books on intelligent design, Ken Ham, if you're at that school, Henry Morris, but especially the later writers make a distinction between what is called methodological evolution and secondly, naturalistic evolution. Let's take the second one first. Naturalistic evolution refers to the fact that there is no possibility for God or mind or anything else outside the pure natural mechanics of this world, and hence the term naturalistic. Methodological evolution refers to the idea that evolution may describe some of the methods and the techniques and the process by which the world achieved its current complexity, but nonetheless, it does not assert a purely naturalistic worldview. In methodological forms of Darwinism, there are a variety of different perspectives. Some of them are Eastern, some are Western, so you would have some perhaps out of Eastern religions who would hold to an ID approach. It is endemic, as he'll say by the end of chapter 14, to understanding that only certain forms of worldview really fit well with even the methodological view of Darwinism, and those would be theism, monotheism specifically is what he means there. Also the possibility of panentheism, that the world is an extension of God's being, and deism, which is the idea that there is a God. He just created the world and then took a very long vacation. And so he goes through what are the main theses of Darwinists. You can find them on pages 266 through 269. And then he gets into, and on 269, under the origins and the Bible section, different ways that Christian theology has related to origin issues, and specifically how Christian theology has related to these origin issues since the time of Darwin's The Origin of Species, published in 1859. He gives a definition of what Darwinism is, and then proceeds into a critique of Darwinism, and specifically at the heart of this chapter, beginning in 278, shows the philosophical commitment to materialism that is at the heart of Darwin's theory, and also the neo-Darwinians, people like Baxter, people like Dennett, and all of those characters, Christopher Hitchens, some of whom have been called the Four Horsemen of the Apocalypse by later writers. He has a very helpful section beginning on 280, taking us all the way down to 287 about the icons of evolution. In other words, the things that evolutionists don't want to tell you about because they demonstrate the weakness of the argument, but are there nonetheless. He moves into another weakness of Darwinism, which is transitional forms, page 287 and following, and gives a discussion about the fact that Darwin predicted there would be transitional forms, missing links, and said that he expected that they would one day be discovered, just like he expected there would be a greater amount of discovery in later years on individual cell life. Darwin knew very little bit about cell science because it was only just beginning to peak the horizon when Darwin rode off into the horizon. So it gets into that discussion there. People like Goldschmidt and Stephen Jay Gould and their approach to these kinds of issues related to origins and missing links. And takes on a few other critiques. I think is a very, very helpful chapter, introductory chapter to Darwin and Darwinism for us as apologists. You're not going to remember everything, but you'll have a resource to go back to. And I've come back to this on more than one occasion because he has a nice little package of information here. 14 is the evidence for intelligent design. Now, intelligent design is in some sense a form of the cosmological argument, but it is distinct enough to merit its own treatment. And that's what he does here in this chapter, is to give us evidence for intelligent design. It's a fairly new argument, at least in the form in which we read it today. This was in some ways the brainchild of Hugh Ross, who is a astrophysicist. I believe he's retired now. I've met Hugh Ross, heard him lecture on a number of occasions, and he gives a very fine presentation on these things. Now, one of the things that comes out of the ID movement is that most ID people are either old earthers or they're young earthers, but they have some kind of methodological evolution built into the young earth understanding. Now, he doesn't say much about that here. Just reading this weekend an article that talked about Ken Ham. You may be surprised to know that Ken Ham is an evolutionist, but he's a methodical evolutionist or methodological evolutionist, and he believes that the evolutionary process took place over an extremely short period of time. Same thing would be true with a number of thinkers in the young earth movement. Talked about origin science and operation science, the difference between the two. And you can tell from reading this that he feels very strongly attracted to the ID movement. On page 305, he gets into the work of Michael Behe, who is a Catholic biochemist, who has articulated the notion of irreducible complexity and argued that at the intercellular or intracellular areas that there is an irreducible complexity that is complex enough that within the cell could never have evolved over time simply in a purely naturalistic sense of the term. I would commend both of these chapters to you, and I think he does a fine job, especially at the end of chapter 14 of laying down sort of some final critiques of Darwinism and an alternative view, which is the intelligent design view. Thanks.